Good afternoon. My name is Ed Salzberg. I'm the Managing Director of the Security and Sustainability Forum, and I welcome you to our webinar called Our Renewable Future. I thank the Post-Carbon Institute and also Island Press for co-hosting this with us and enabling us to run this session. I also thank Reid Detchon, who's the Vice President for Climate and Energy at the United Nations Foundation. He also runs the Energy Future Coalition, for agreeing to moderate this session. Reid has been a panelist on a past session, and I really appreciate him taking the time to run this session. I also invite you to go to the Security and Sustainability Forum archives, where you can see the past recordings that we've done. We've got about 80 climate change, energy-related webinars up there covering all of the major issues. ssfonline.org will get you there. We have two other webinars coming up in September in which registration is open. Both of these are with Island Press, Healthy Cities in the Era of Climate Change and Biting the Hands That Feed Us. And again, you can go to the ssfonline.org site in order to sign up. This presentation pairs two authors, Richard Heinberg and David Fridley, who just wrote Our Renewable Future, hence the title of the webinar. I read this book. This is a terrific book. If you read this book, you will learn a tremendous amount about where renewable energy really fits into the future scheme of sustainable energy and the whole energy picture. I just really recommend this book really highly. And you can save 20% on the book if you go to the Island Press website and use the discount code listed here. Here's how this is going to run. I'm going to introduce Reid in just slightly more detail. Reid will introduce our two presenters, David and Richard, and then each of them will provide about a 25-minute presentation based on the research that supported the book. We'll roll into discussion questions that Reid will moderate, and I ask that you add your questions to the question box in the GoToWebinar panel. Just open that up and drop your questions in, and we'll pick those up, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. I ask that you also take the brief exit survey at the end. It'll only take you a minute or two to fill it out, but it really does help us improve the quality of the sessions. And finally, on your screen, on your control panel, there's a handout section. If you just open that up, you'll be able to download right now the presentation that you're about to see. As I mentioned, Reid is with the United Nations Foundation and also directs the Energy Future Coalition, which is funded in large part by the foundation. And he was at the Department of Energy for quite a while, where he's the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Conservation and Renewable Energy. He's also supported, he's also been staff with several congressmen, and he really brings a great perspective here on energy overall, and especially renewable energy in an era of climate change. And I'm just really pleased that Reid has agreed to moderate this session. And with that, I'm going to turn the session over to Reid to introduce our two speakers.
Well, thank you, Ed. It's a pleasure to be here today, and the topic and your introduction provides me a sense of context here that I'll share briefly. As Ed mentioned, we run a public policy initiative called the Energy Future Coalition. And roughly 10 years ago, in conjunction with partners in the agriculture and forestry communities, we launched an initiative called 25 by 25, 25% renewable energy from our lands and resources in the U.S. By 2025. At that time, it seemed breathtakingly ambitious. And yet here we are in 2015 or 16. In 2015, the General Assembly of the United Nations endorsed the goal of energy for all in Sustainable Development Goal 7, including a doubling of the renewable energy share in the global energy mix, which if you remove the share currently provided by traditional biomass, will require a very substantial and ambitious increase, but again to, let's say, 30% of the world's energy supply by 2030. Today we're going to be talking about 100% renewable energy, which would have been complete fantasy several years ago, but increasingly is seen as not only necessary but attainable objectives. So the topic could not be any more timely in conjunction with the Paris Climate Agreement, in conjunction with the Sustainable Development Goals, and obviously in conjunction with a livable planet. So wonderful panelists that are going to be presenting today. I will introduce them reverse order to what you see on your screen, because David will be speaking first. As you can note, he's at Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory, which is one of the really leading research laboratories of the Department of Energy with regard to renewable energy and energy efficiency. And David's research has involved extensive collaboration with China on end-use energy efficiency, on industrial energy use, government energy management programs, data and analysis, and medium and long-term energy policy research. So he brings a great perspective and will provide an overview of energy use, especially in the U.S. and China, to frame the conversation. Richard Heinberg is at the Post-Carbon Institute, which has as a mission leading the transition to a more resilient, equitable, and sustainable world by providing individuals and communities with the resources they need to understand and respond to the interrelated ecological, economic, energy, and equity crises of the 21st century. And it's actually that interrelationship, I think, that is the most interesting, complicated, and challenging part of this. Richard has written 13 books, which I won't list here, but suffice it to say that he's well qualified to take this conversation forward, and he will focus particularly on the opportunities of renewable energy to contribute not just in the electricity sector, but across the entire economy. So, two fabulous speakers, and I'm going to leave it to them to make the presentations, then we'll come back in, as Ed indicated, with questions, and you're all encouraged either as we're going along or at that moment to type in your questions, and we'll try to organize them in some meaningful way. So with that, David, let me throw it to you to kick us off.
Thank you, Reid, and thank you, Ed, for the setup and organization, and certainly thanks to all the attendees who are taking time out of their day to attend this and listen to what we have to say. I just want to start with a few words about how this book came about. The Post-Carbon Institute, as Reid described, it's vitally concerned with this transition from fossil fuels to a renewably powered world, and in our discussions about how can we contribute to this discussion about the transition, it was apparent to all of us that most of the discussion to date has centered around how do we change the supply of energy. And there's been relatively little consideration, certainly consideration in depth, given to the myriad and complex ways that we use energy. So in the end, I was very happy to get the opportunity to work with Richard Heinberg to write this book. And in this book, we delve deeply into the issues about how we use energy and the implications of that to this transition to renewable energy. So I think the best way to start, once I figure out the clicking here, is to look at, how do we use energy, and where do we stand today in terms of this energy question. And what's on the screen is what's called a Sankey diagram. It's illustrating the energy flows in the U.S. economy in 2015. And on the left is what we would typically call the primary energy forms, the solar, nuclear, gas, coal, oil, crude oil, and so forth, that where everything starts. The middle part of the graph is what we call transformation, where those forms of energy are transformed into the kinds of energy we want to use, such as power generation, or in the refinery transforming crude oil into gasoline, diesel, or asphalt. And then finally on the right is what we call final energy or end-use energy, divided into these traditional categories of residential and commercial, industrial, and transportation. These are the services, the energy services that we want from our energy sources. I won't go into detail to this, but I want to leave two major points about this. One is, if you look in the upper middle part of the graph, you see that there's an enormous loss of energy through the power generation sector. 60 in the U.S., 2/3 of the energy that goes into power generation is lost and wasted pretty much as heat. The U.S. is not the most efficient power generator in the world, but even in more efficient locations, this kind of thermal conversion may just be a few percent higher. So there's an enormous loss of our primary energy just because we want electricity. And the second point is the lower right with transportation. And this is another major source of wasted energy in our system. You can see of all the petroleum and other fuels that go into the transportation sector, the vast majority of it is lost and wasted as heat. So there's two big sources of focus about reducing that waste and finding renewable alternatives, but we can't forget that we also have to deal with industry and buildings as well. Overall, 60% of the energy we use in this country is lost as heat. And the services we want, the mobility, the warm houses, the lighting, the education, the health services, is all provided by just 39% of our energy. Most of the studies, and like I said, most of the studies you've seen so far about a renewable future focus very heavily on the left side of this graph. What kind of technologies and alternatives are there to replace the primary energy supply? And much less is looked at of the details on the right side about how we use energy, and that's going to be our focus. So in the United States, how do we use energy? This is looking again at that right side of the graph, and it goes into, provides more detail about here really the nature of the various fuels that we use to provide all those services we want every day. You notice at about 6 o'clock on the left-hand pie, that big slice of about 1/4 is the motor gasoline that we use to move people around the country. But it's not just gasoline we use. Diesel, which is about 10 o'clock on the pie, also provides mobility, but that's primarily for things, for stuff. And diesel also runs the agricultural sector, and it also heats homes in the Northeast. In the United States, unlike many countries, particularly in Asia, very little coal is used directly at the end-use level. Nearly all of it, 98% of the coal that we use, goes to power generation. That's not the case with natural gas. About half of the natural gas we use is either to power industry to create heat, or used in buildings, in homes and office and hotels and otherwise for heating and cooking, hot water, and so forth. Of all this energy we use every day, only 21% of it is in the form of electricity. And that 21% is broken out further on the right-hand side, and you can see that there's still a substantial amount of coal generation in the U.S., although it continues to decline while the natural gas part expands. The nuclear part is pretty much stagnant, and as is hydro. And yet, even after years of expansion of renewable energy, the solar, wind, and geothermal portion still is quite modest. So, what this shows us is creating a renewable electricity grid only gets us part of the way to where we need to be. Once we fully decarbonize the electricity grid, we still have 80% of the energy that we use every day that needs to be decarbonized in some form or another. But the U.S. is not the largest energy system in the world. So it's useful to look at the largest and, in my view, the most challenging one, which is China. China consumes 40% more energy than the U.S. and emits nearly twice as much CO2 because its energy system is so heavily coal-based. And so some of the big differences you'll notice on this compared with the U.S. is that gasoline is just a small fraction of the total. It's about 4 o'clock on the left-hand pie. That's in part because China has a much smaller fleet of vehicles than we do. It's been growing rapidly but remains smaller, but at the same time the vehicles on average are more efficient than the ones that we use in this country, so that keeps that gasoline growth more modest. Whereas in China, diesel is a much more important fuel. This is not just for moving all the freight around that in the country, the cement and the grain and so forth, but also the 3 billion tons of coal that it ships by rail every year to power the rest of the economy. And coal and coal derivatives, that's the coke, the coking gas, still account for half of China's total final energy use. That's, again, compares to just 1.5% in the U.S. And even electricity is a somewhat smaller section than the U.S. It's just 19% of the total, yet it's 75% coal-based. China does have the largest hydro generation in the world, but it's actually within shouting distance of reaching its technical potential for a hydro expansion. And they certainly are a world leader in solar and wind capacity installation. But as you can see here, it's been a very rapid growth, but from a very small base. So it's still only contributing a few percent to China's electricity. So it's essentially the same story as the U.S. Even if China can fully decarbonize their power sector, it still leaves 80% of the rest of the economy running on fossil fuels, for which some kind of alternative needs to be found. There's 2 ways that we consume energy. We consume it directly when you flip a switch or you turn the ignition in a car or light your stove. But we also consume it indirectly through the purchase of goods and services. And this indirect use of energy is measured as embodied energy, which is really the sum of all the energy that's used to produce a particular good or service, including, in a case of a product, the raw material extraction, the transportation, manufacturing, assembling, construction, disposal, and so forth. Embodied energy can be quite significant, and it can be a large percent of the lifetime of a particular product. It's useful to think about it in these terms because this energy, it represents all the activities along the supply chain that provides this particular good or service. And in a fully renewable world, this entire supply chain will need to run on renewable energy, or if that's not possible, the chain needs to be reorganized in order to be able to do so. This concept of embodied energy is actually the basis of a growing food movement, the locavore movement about sourcing and eating your food from locally grown and sustainable sources. It as well is a consideration of all the energy and resources that are expended to bring us food. Most of, for most goods that we purchase, the supply chain and the sources of energy embodied in it involves manufacturing. So this is a look at how about energy use in the manufacturing sector in the U.S. and China. And you can see in the U.S., electricity is only 12% of the energy used within the manufacturing sector. So other options are going to be needed to supplant the other fuel forms, either as a fuel substitute or as a process substitute in being able to produce a particular good in a different way. But, China is a source of most of our daily goods, and their manufacturing sector is 60% dependent on coal and coal derivatives. Part of this is because there is a high degree of heavy industrial activity in China that produces energy-intensive goods such as steel and cement, aluminum, ammonia, and so forth. But renewable alternatives in these sectors will be quite challenging since they all involve the use of very high degree heat, over 1,000 degrees centigrade in its processes. For example, if we look at cement, the case of cement, with the pun fully intended, is the foundation of modern civilization. It's everywhere. You can't avoid it day to day. It's so ubiquitous and so fundamental that each of us consumes 4 tons in the form of concrete every single year. It's the basis of the entire built environment in the world. But it's a double climate threat since it emits as much CO2 from the limestone feedstock that goes into the calcination to produce the cement as it does from the energy that's consumed to do the calcination. So for each ton of cement, you get a ton of CO2. Last year, China produced 2.3 billion tons of cement, which means 2.3 billion tons of CO2 just from that single source in that single country. But aside from just the production of the cement itself, cement in itself embodies certain energies, such as the energy to mine the limestone, which is done by diesel in these big trucks and excavators, transporting the rock. There's other energy you have to use to quarry the sand, the aggregate needed to produce concrete. And aside from the electricity that runs motors on conveyors, very little of this process is electrified, and currently no fully renewable production process exists for cement. The embodied energy in buildings is also substantial, and it's largely fossil fuel based, from material production for drywall and steel, glass, aluminum, and so forth, to the transport of these materials, to construction, maintenance of buildings, and their decommissioning and disposal. These are all largely fossil fuel based processes. They're not quite as well documented as the use of buildings, in which we have a better sense of the data. And on the right side here, I'm showing the average annual final energy consumption for a single-family home in the United States. And you can see that our homes are more electrified than manufacturing or these other processes. About 43% of the energy used in homes is in the form of electricity. And that makes sense. If you look at the breakdown, you can see air conditioning and refrigerator, they're 100% electrified. We just don't have alternatives that we use to any degree here. But for those other services we need, like heating our water, heating the living area that we're in, it's still largely not electrified. And all of these, there'll have to be alternatives in all of these cases. What's typically left out of studies talking about, deployment of renewable electricity or electric systems is that doesn't just involve the cost of, building your new solar or your wind or hydro facilities, but there's also these end user costs that aren't going to be calculated, such as the cost of replacing a gas water heater with an electric one, or a gas stove with an electric one, and so forth. These are going to be borne by the end user. Now, there are many ways, particularly in new construction, to dramatically reduce the total energy load in a house, and that's obviously a priority strategy in terms of for the housing stock. But as the use part declines, then this embodied energy contained in materials, transport, assembly, manufacturing, and so forth, then figures even more prominently in the total energy footprint of the building. So in looking at what is our strategy for buildings, we have to look at that entire supply chain. I mean, there are technology strategies that can be used to reduce energy use in the house, yet actually increase the amount of energy across the total supply chain to provide that technology. So we need to be a more system-oriented in terms of thinking about energy reduction and conversion strategies in the building sector. Another example of a product with extensive supply chains that are all linked by non-renewable fuel use, and were actually shaped by both the availability and the low cost of non-renewable fossil fuels is clothing. This is Levi's own schematic on the supply chain for a single pair of Levi 501 jeans, starting with the raw material production in the U.S. being trucked to another country to make fabric, being trucked to another country or shipped to another country to be cut, garment assembly yet in another country, garment finish in yet another country, and then shipped all back to the U.S. to be transported by truck, diesel fuel, around the country to its final consumption. As a result of this extensive supply chain, they estimate that a single pair of jeans embodies a total of over 100 kilowatt hours of energy. Now, of course, the consumer use part of this is the most prominent. That's the washing and drying of the jeans over its lifetime. We do have renewable alternatives for that. You can hang it out in the sun. You can wash it by hand, but is such a long, complex supply chain really feasible in an all-renewable world? And I would suggest that instead of trying to find a renewable alternative to support an existing supply chain that was built on the existence and cost of fossil fuels, that the chain itself needs to be modified or collapse. The CO2 emissions from one pair of jeans is not trivial. I mean, I would joke that if everyone planted 6 trees for every pair of jeans they got, we'd be the most forested country in the world. The food system suffers from the same problem, and I would say that our modern food system is a abject failure from the sustainability point of view. As you can see here, we in this country expend 12 times more energy to produce our food than what is delivered to us in energetic terms from our food. That is a remarkable, I mean, in physics terms, this is a true energy sink. Energy sinks are not sustainable. And so I think this is an area of focus that needs much more work. Food systems don't have to be energy sinks. I mean, prior to the Industrial Revolution, we had a number of leading civilizations around the world, in China, in Europe, in Africa and Central America, where they achieved a high level of both urbanization, culture, and so forth on a food system that consumed 0.9 units of energy for each unit that was supplied. So even with that 10% energy surplus was what was necessary to allow the flourishing of these kind of advanced societies. But in contrast, in the U.S. today, the food system alone consumes 15% of our total energy, but it provides only a little more than 1% equivalent of the total energy that we use in our society. And part of this is are these long supply chains that we've developed to bring us our food. This is the example of a cornflake for your breakfast. All links of these chains are connected by oil-based transportation. All the red lines you see in the graph is where oil is used in the process, not to mention the oil that's used and the natural gas to produce the fertilizer and pesticides that's used to grow the original corn. In the past, and not that long in the past, certainly in the 60s and early 70s, this supply chain was much shorter and it was highly seasonal. Your fruits and vegetables tend to be what was available during that time of year, and you didn't expect to see a strawberry in February. But the invention of the refrigerated cold chain completely changed that to the point now where 5% of the containers that move around the world are refrigerated, just moving food from place to place. Decarbonizing a supply chain that looks like this would be very challenging, and as with the case with the blue jeans, it may just require cutting out steps of the chain and shortening it altogether. Now, everyone's very familiar with transportation on a day-to-day basis, but there's, again, a lot more to a vehicle than just the fuel used to run it. If you look at the embodied elements in your vehicle, you've got manufacturing, you've got the production of the fuel itself, and the infrastructure that allows you to actually use your car. In terms of the manufacturing of a vehicle, electricity is about 27% of the total. So the manufacturing process itself has its own challenges in terms of trying to find alternatives, renewable alternatives to support this. The infrastructure it shows 2% here, but that's still pretty remarkable. I mean, this is looking at all of the roads, bridges, parking lots, and so forth that are shared by hundreds of thousands of cars, and yet, and the energy intensity of that infrastructure, because it's cement and asphalt and so forth, still adds 2% to the energy footprint of a relatively efficient car. This is describing a Prius. A Prius has, compared to a SUV, may get 4 to 5 times better mileage, and so its operation phase is relatively lower compared to the other phases of its production and use. A gas guzzler may be something like 80% operations, yet it doesn't, because it just uses so much more energy. So as with buildings, the more efficient the operation phase becomes, the more important the supply chain is to the total energy footprint. Now, the purpose of our built environment, we tend to classify all of our activities in the world as being industrial or commercial or residential or transportation. But really the whole purpose of the industrial built environment is to provide for people. Every one of those services is for a person. And I was a bit, uncomfortable with the traditional approach to measuring the energy impact of having people in cities by just dividing it up into these traditional sectors. I developed a different way to measure it, looking at both the operational energy used to run a system as well as the embodied energy in the infrastructure, and more importantly, the consumption that the people do in the city from the angle of a single resident in the city. And my first example city was Suzhou, China. It's a beautiful city west of Shanghai, a lot of tourism, highly urbanized. And in analyzing there, I found that only 1/3 of the energy footprint of a typical resident actually came from the direct energy consumption. 2/3 of the energy footprint was in the form of their embodied energy consumption, both from the infrastructure that they have, the buildings, the roads, sidewalks, and so forth, but also from the nature of their purchases. I found that 61% of their embodied energy was derived from the embodied energy in the variety of products and services that they consume every day, from having insurance to buying food and clothing. And of that, food was the single largest impact for their consumption. If you look at the U.S., I don't have a similar kind of analysis for a U.S. city, but we can see that a very similar thing in terms of U.S. household expenditures, where monetary expenditures will roughly correlate to energy requirements upstream. And here we see in 2014 that energy is only 9% of the money that we spend annually for an average household, and most of it in the form of gasoline, electricity, and natural gas. Everything else, transportation, the food, healthcare,